Mr. Chairman, so we need to reduce the cost of going to college, but we can't do it until we get the facts straight on what is driving the cost of college and how student loan debt is affecting our families. Dr. Akers, you've written several analyses of the impact of student loan debt, and you gave some summary of that here today. You use data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, which is conducted by the Federal Reserve Board. But I noticed that your conclusion based on these data contradict the Federal Reserve's analysis of its own data. For example, you say that typical borrowers are, quote, no worse off now than they were a generation ago, close quote, while Federal Reserve Chair Janet Yellen seems to think that many borrowers are worse off. Now, Chair Yellen analyzed federal data about families in the lower half of the income spectrum. And data show that in less than 2 decades, outstanding student loan debt jumped from 26% of average income up to 58% of average income. That's more than double. Do you dispute the Fed's analysis of their own data?
Absolutely not. So I think that there's room here for both of us to be contributing valid points.
Well, let's start. So you think the Federal Reserve got this part right?
Sure. I think they're right. I think there's truth in both of the claims.
Well, so let me ask about that. This is a huge increase in the debt to income ratio, and yet you say in your published work that you believe borrowers are no worse off than their counterparts were 20 years ago. And I'm trying to understand that.
Sure. The basis for that statement perhaps is what I can offer here. So first of all, when we look at the long-run affordability of these student loan debts, we lean on the information that we have that the returns to college education are positive on average. So in a long-run sense.
So wait, the question is not whether or not it's still good to go get a college education. I think everyone in this room signs on for that proposition. The question is whether or not people who are trying to do it now are in a much tougher spot than people who are trying to do it a generation ago. You describe it as no worse off. And yet, based on your numbers, borrowers' annual income over this time period has gone up by 17%. Their debt load is up by 150%. So they have a little more money and a lot more debt over the last generation. How can you say they're not worse off?
So it's important to remember that when we're comparing income to debt accumulation, we need to be thinking about lifelong income and not just annual income.
But that is what we're talking about.
We don't need annual income to keep pace on a dollar-for-dollar basis with the amount of debt that's increased, or the increase in price, essentially, in order to do the cost-benefit analysis for college in general.
I'm sorry, we're back to the original point. The question is not, does it make sense financially by the time you're 65 to have gotten a college diploma? It certainly does. I'm looking at your published statement that a generation today's generation is no worse off than 20 years ago. And yet, all I can see is income has gone up 17%, debt has gone up 150%. It seems to me that means that people today are a whole lot worse off, on average, if they have to borrow money to go to school.
Well, I'll offer an additional statement to support that claim, and that's based on the transitive burden that student loan debt is imposing on these households. So what we look at is what is the ratio of monthly payments to monthly income for these young households who are carrying student loan debt, and we see, surprisingly, I think, that it's remained flat or even declined over the past 20 years.
So, in fact, I looked at that part of your research, and what that part of your research says is that families today are stretching it out, a much bigger debt burden, but they're stretching it out over decades longer than they used to. So you say they are no worse off, even though they will be paying more interest and they will be paying for a much longer period of time. They're no worse off because they can pay more, they can pay longer, they can pay when they should be working on helping their own children get an education and when they should be saving money for retirement. You know, a lot of people would think that being able to pay off your debt in 10 years versus being able to pay it off in 20 years or 30 years, you're worse off if you have to make those same payments over a much longer period of time?
Yeah, absolutely. That piece of evidence alone doesn't tell us anything about what's happening to the long-run well-being of these borrowers and how it's changed over time. There are two aspects of affordability. First is the long-run affordability. I think the best evidence we have on long-run affordability comes from our estimates of the financial return on the investment, and then the transitive burden, or the month-to-month
As I said,
affordability.
what we're trying to get is the intergenerational, because what I'm focused on is the question of whether or not kids are doing worse today. It just seems to me, based on your research and on the Fed's research, both of which show a substantial increase in debt loads, that it is a serious problem. And I don't think it's responsible to sit here and claim that borrowers are, quote, no worse off, while people are still struggling to make much higher student loan payments than ever before and carrying their debt for much longer than ever before. It seems clear to me that the Federal Reserve, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Treasury Department, and other experts who've been sounding the alarm on student debt got it right. Rising student loan debt is hurting our families and it's hurting our economy. We need to make changes. We need to make them now. But that means taking an objective look at our student loan program instead of trying to sweep this problem under the rug. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.